Hello, welcome to our ESMT Open Lecture this evening. My name is Ihlbrock, and it's my chance to, my privilege to introduce our speaker this evening. Ottmar Edenhofer is the Director and Chief Economist of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and one of the world's leading experts on the economics of climate change. From 2008 to 2015, he co-chaired the Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He was instrumental in shaping the fifth assessment report on climate change, which provided the scientific basis for the Paris Agreement. Since April of 2022, Ottmar Edenhofer has chaired the newly established European Advisory Council on Climate Change. Its mission is to provide independent scientific advice and produce reports that capture the extent to which EU policies are consistent with the 2021 European Climate Change Act and the EU's commitments under the Paris Agreement. Today's discussion will be moderated by Michael Knoer, a second-year Master's in Management student at ESMT and the project lead for the TEDx, which the fourth annual TEDx, which will be held in February of next year here. We're really looking forward to a lively discussion. I'd like to welcome everyone who is also online. We will be taking questions after the Q&A and a short moderated discussion. So please join me in welcoming Ottmar Edenhofer.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I hope you can hear me well. So what I would like to do today is, if you could help me to start the presentation, what I would like to do today is to explain you a little bit why I think we are now entering a new phase in international climate policy. And the way how I would like to explain this is that the next phase is managing the global carbon cycle. So this sounds a little bit like a very nerdy way to approach this. And I would like to explain you how we have to govern what I call the CDR options, the carbon dioxide removal options. So at first glance, this sounds very technical, a little bit technocratic, but I hope I can convince you that this new phase of climate policy is essential. And it is the best way to understand what are the real challenges of climate policy. So I want to do this in 3 steps. First, I explain you a little bit the state of knowledge on climate change. I will do this very briefly. Then I talk about climate targets and carbon dioxide removals. And then I introduce the new governance challenges. Some of them I think can be resolved. Some of them are new and requires a new thinking. Now let me start with the state of knowledge on climate change. So this is a very busy slide, but an important one. And the most important thing here is to explain you that global mean temperature is rising and rising. And by the way, also global emissions are rising and rising. And this basically means that this year in 2023, we are venturing into an uncharted climate territory. If you look at the Antarctic sea ice extent, the global sea ice extent, the North Atlantic Ocean sea surface temperature, the world ocean sea surface temperature, and also the cumulative error burned in Canada, you basically see that all these scenarios or all this data are basically a way into an uncharted climate territory. So this is really exceptional. And this is something where we can see that we depart from our historical experience. And it is not just about the global mean temperature. It is also, if you take into account this kind of indicators. So far, so good. And I could continue to explain you in all the details what are the climate impacts. So why the extreme weather events, the frequency, and also the intents of the extreme weather events are increasing. I could go on to explain you why tipping points in the Earth system will be activated and so on. But this is something which I don't want to talk too much because I want to focus on the solution side. But before I explain the solution side, I want to explain you with this slide the challenge of climate policy. So first of all, if we want to avoid dangerous climate change, even if we are entering now this uncharted territory, if we want to avoid dangerous climate change or extreme dangerous climate change, so the challenge is we have to limit the increase of global mean temperature because this is really the most important indicator. And one of the most important insights of the IPCC is that we can translate the increase, the global mean temperature boundary and the global mean temperature limit into a global carbon budget. So this is very important to understand. So we can explain how much we can use the disposal space of the atmosphere. For example, if we want to limit the increase of global mean temperature around 2 degrees, so we would be allowed to release cumulative 909 gigatons CO2. If we want to limit the global mean temperature around 1.5, so then we are only allowed to release 240 gigatons CO2. This is a huge range. But this range is important because these are the targets or the limits of the Paris Agreement. These are the most important focal points. Our colleagues from the climate impact research explains us if we are in a position to limit the increase of global mean temperature between 1.5 and 2 degrees, at least we can limit climate change in a way or to an extent which is at least manageable for humankind. Now, I will talk about this limit between 1.5 and 2 degrees, but let's phrase this as the most important focal point. What I did here for the sake of simplicity, I assume that in the end, we are able to limit global mean temperature of 1.8 degrees. And this would imply that we can release 615 gigatons CO2 in the atmosphere. You can understand the challenge of such a number if you confront this number with the fossil fuel resources underground. And we have basically 10,600 gigatons CO2 underground in form of coal, oil, and gas. And given the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere, we have an oversupply of fossil fuels. An oversupply of fossil fuels. We are not running out of fossil fuels. And this is very important to understand. And I would like to invite you to a thought experiment. So let's think about that we would be in a different kind of world, where we would have 615 gigatons underground, and we would be allowed to release 10,000 gigatons CO2 into the atmosphere. So how would such a world look like? What would be the implication? The first implication would be, I would not give this lecture today in the evening. Why? Because if we have 615 gigatons underground, this would imply that the fossil fuel prices for oil, coal, and gas would increase dramatically. So not a climate economist would stand here, probably a resource economist, and would explain you how important it is to increase energy efficiency, to promote renewables. In some parts of the world might be also included nuclear power, but at least we have to promote fossil-free renewables, because if we want to keep our competitiveness intact in Europe, in Germany, in the US, so then we have to do this. And the nice implication is that the price development at the international resource market would solve this problem. We have to respond to this, but the price increase of the resource market would solve that problem. We are not in such a situation. We are not in such a situation. The resource markets will not solve that problem. This is the first time in economic history, and I would even argue in human history, that humankind has to impose the scarcity of resources with an international agreement. It's not what nature is doing. So we are good to understand, and we are good to respond to the scarcity which nature has imposed on us. Our whole economic history is all about that, right? So when basically we had the wood crisis in Europe, so we basically explored coal. We have been in a position to use coal in a very effective way, and this was part of the industrialization. So we are very good in the past to respond to scarcity which nature has imposed on us. But this is the first time that we need an international agreement which defines that the disposal space of the atmosphere should be limited. This is nothing what nature is doing. What nature is doing, nature responds to an overuse of the atmosphere with increasing climate damages. If we want to avoid this, we need an international agreement, and this international agreement has to define that the atmosphere should be perceived as a limiting disposal space, but has to be managed in a fair and in an efficient way. So that's the challenge. But the problem here is that any kind of international agreement has a strong incentive for free riding. When some people agree on an agreement and say we want to reduce, so there is always an incentive for free riding when all the other countries are doing this. If the resource market would do this and we have one price on the world market for coal, oil, and gas, there is no free rider. If you do not respond to the price increase, so you will pay the price with with a decreasing competitiveness. But in this case, you can increase your competitiveness if you behave like a free rider. So that's the challenge. And this is exactly the challenge which we will see in the COP28 in a few weeks from now in Dubai. Okay. Now, let me explain a little bit this graph. So this is a busy graph, but a quite important one. And if you look at the right-hand side, you see basically two trajectories for global mean temperature. The blue one is where we basically stick to the 1.5 limit. And over the rest of the century, we basically approach this limit, and then we stabilize the temperature around this 1.5. So this is what we hoped for many years, that this would be a realistic pathway. In order to assess this pathway, I would like to invite you to look at the left-hand side. At the left-hand side, you see the blue line, and the blue line can be characterized in the following way. We have to reduce the global emissions roughly by 10% per annum. We have to achieve net zero by 2050, and then we can stabilize the emissions around this zero line. But what you can see here is we should start with the reduction of emissions immediately, and minus 10%. This is nothing what we have ever done in economic history. So let's be a little bit more realistic and say we allow an overshoot scenario. So we basically overshoot 1.5, and here basically it's an overshoot around 1.8. And then basically over the next few decades, until the end of the century, we bend the curve, and then we basically converge to the 1.5. This is what our colleagues from climate science call an overshoot scenario. Now let us translate these overshoot scenarios in emission reduction. And this is the red line on the left-hand side. So we can stabilize the global emissions in the next few years. Then we reduce the emissions roughly around minus 6%, which is enormously ambitious. We achieved then the zero line in around 2050, but after 2050, we need net negative emissions. Net negative emissions. And this is something which is very important to understand what net negative emissions imply. So let me identify the three phases of climate policy. The first one is reducing emissions. The second phase is achieving net zero. And then after the second half of the century, to achieve net negative. This is an enormous challenge. And what I would like to explain you is that these negative emissions are extremely important. And I call this the planetary waste management. Why? Because net negative emissions allows us basically to bend the temperature curve, come back to the 1.5. And this is not without risk. If we do an overshoot between 1.5 and 1.8, we will lose the coral reefs. So there are climate impacts. I'm not saying this is a riskless option, but probably this is the only realistic option we have. Now, let me explain you a little bit where we are. And this is something which is really, I would say, frustrating. Next week, you will see basically the publication of the UNEP emission gap report, and I reveal a secret. This emission gap report will tell you that the global emissions are still rising. We have not bent the curve. So this is a little bit more optimistic. What our colleagues have done here is they have basically identified the trends from the implemented current policies. This is what governments have promised to do. Very optimistic, because this implies that governments are implementing what they have promised. In fact, obviously, they haven't done this so far. So in the end, what this picture shows is the government have promised too less, and what they have promised is not implemented, right? So according to this scenario, we are basically would be around 2.6 degrees, but this is something where we assume that governments implement this, and this is not where we are. So we are still on the 3 to 4 degree pathway. And the rest of the scenarios shows you what we have to do with 2 degree and 1.5. Okay, so to characterize this a little bit, so what does this mean? We need a peak in 2020. This was yesterday. So fast emission reduction, climate neutrality, net removal. This implies we have to decarbonize the power sector fully for the use of renewables and energy efficiency. We need electrification of the power sector. Then we have to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors like freight transport, aviation, shipping, heavy industry. So here the option is direct and indirect electrification, and again, a compensation of the hard-to-abate sectors. But then in the end, we have to come to the net negative. And I would like to explain this a little bit more in detail. And this is just to summarize my first part. We have 3 phases. So we have to reduce emissions. By 2050, we will have residual emissions, in particular from the industry sector, from the agriculture sector. So then we have to compensate these emissions for net zero. But then CDR requires net negative and in order to overcompensate the overshoot. Now, this requires an industrial management of the whole carbon cycle. And climate policy is much more than just to decarbonize the electricity sector. It's much more than renewables. It's even much more than just to electrify the transport sector. So let me explain these different components here. You see, basically, we have the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is a sink for CO2, but this atmosphere is limiting disposal space is already overflowing. And therefore, we have to find other sinks, like the geological formations. And this is what we call CDR. CDR is carbon dioxide removal. Here, it's reducing net emissions, balancing residual emissions, or removing emissions from the atmosphere with durable storage. This is what we call CDR. Then we have CCS. CCS is reducing emissions from industrial and energy-related sources with durable storage. So this can be done either you basically capture CO2 from gas and coal-fired plant, and then you sequester it in geological formations. But we could also do this when we basically produce blue hydrogen. This CCS option is also important for when we produce cement, and then we have to capture CO2 and store it underground. And the last component is CCU. This is called carbon capture and usage. For example, if we would use woods and we replace wooden buildings or with cement buildings, so then reduce emissions, and then basically we store CO2 in the woods, and when we combine it with afforestation, so then we can have here a net storage of carbon. But this is, of course, most of the time not permanent, because so when basically wood becomes waste, so then we have to deal with the waste. Either we store the waste again in the geological formations, or we have to compensate this non-permanent option. So this is, roughly speaking, the ingredients of the carbon management. And most of the time in the public or in the press, you see a lot of confusion around this concept. But the most important thing is to understand is that we have to find other reservoirs in addition to the atmosphere in order to manage the global carbon cycle. Okay, so let me explain you first of all where we are. So, and again, I apologize, these are very busy graphs, but within the IPCC, we are good to produce busy graphs, which most of the time are not comprehensible, but this is what we are doing all the time. But yeah, of course, so you can become very prominent even with such graphs. But let me explain that a little bit. So what this shows is that these are different scenarios. Some scenarios are focusing on renewables. Some scenarios focusing on demand side solution. For example, the change for diets and reducing the use of cars and such kinds of things. But you see, basically, by 2030, in all these scenarios, even the scenarios which have strong focus on renewables, requires a lot of CDR, a large amount of CDRs. And the gray bars are where basically we see the current potential. And there's a huge gap, and we have to close the gap. And this requires a scaling up, a rapid scaling up of carbon dioxide removals, particularly within the next decade. This is nothing which we can do in the next century or in the next 2 decades. We have to start with it now. And in 2050, you see that basically we have even a stronger increase of CDR options. So what are the CDR options? So here we have basically very conventional CDR option, carbon dioxide removals, afforestation, reforestation. So that's the most important one. Then soil carbon sequestration. And I already mentioned durable harvested wood products could be used. So this is a quite conventional thing, but this is not enough. And we have to think about novel CDR methods, and all the novel CDR methods are basically under development, unfortunately, only for pilot projects. So we have no large-scale deployment of these options. But let me mention a few of them and then explain at least one a little bit more in detail. Now, the first one is biochar. Biochar is basically also binding CO2, enhanced rock weathering, ocean fertilization, the use of bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage. If you basically burn bioenergy or produce electricity or heat, so then you can capture the CO2 and storage underground. The same can be done with technical filters, and this is called DAX, direct air capture, where you basically absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. And you can use this atmospheric CO2, for example, for producing synthetic fuels. So then you have carbon neutral fuels, in particular for the shipping or the aviation sector. And part of this CO2 you can storage underground, and then you have net negative emissions. So these are all the technologies which would enable us to produce net negative emissions. So the announced CDR targets imply a faster ramp up than it has been seen historically for most technologies. So we know from the deployment of all sorts of technologies what are basically the deployment after some kind of pilot projects. And so what we would need is an unprecedented scaling up of these technologies. There are some investments, in particular in the United States. Occidental, for example, has bought a startup for 3.2 billion and invest in DAX. There are a few smaller projects even in Germany, and there are a lot of startups dealing with that. But we have to understand and we have to see. So what will be the deployment? And unfortunately, there is no governance structure, no incentive structure, which would help us to scale that up. So the most important thing is, I don't want to sell this CDR option as a kind of a silver bullet. So CDR has to be complemented by other technological developments, in particular in the renewable sector. CDR has to be complemented by energy efficiency, has to be complemented by all sorts of technologies. And we should not rely just on one CDR option. Even if people think that DAX, direct air capture, might be the best way to do, some people think bioenergy plus CCS is the way to go. So the most important thing is, what we have to do is we have to think in portfolio. We need a portfolio of CDR options. And higher CDR availability, and this is the most important message here, can lead to lower levels of net emissions and hence enable earlier emission neutrality. So the CDR option would basically allow us to achieve more ambitious climate goals. It will allow us for an overshoot. The second aspect here is, of course, there are trade-offs, there are risks, like all technologies. And in the early phase of a technology, people see the opportunities and the advantages. So the more mature technology becomes, people start to think about risks and trade-offs. And there's always then a tendency to write off this kind of technologies. And the second aspect is the largest CDR potential is not in Germany. The largest CDR potential, in, for example, in DAX, is where renewables are cheap, where you have a lot of land available. And for example, in the MENA region, there's a huge potential for CDR. So it's not the best way to do this in Germany. And therefore, we need international cooperation to deploy this kind of technological options. Now, let me talk a little bit about the societal challenge. Of course, basically all the scenarios I know assume some kind of CDR, but still there are different scenarios which basically rely to a different extent to the CDR. For example, if we would reduce our demand significantly, less CDR is required. If we would rely more on the supply side dimension, so then we need more CDR. So this is nothing which comes from technology, from physics alone. This has a lot to do with our behavior. And the more we wait for reducing emissions, the more we need this CDR options for compensating the overshoot. So declining energy demand due to innovation. So CDR is only then through afforestation. We could have a strong focus on sustainability and adapted consumption. So a low carbon technology innovation, well-managed land systems, low acceptance of BECCS. So then we could limit this. If we shift in energy generation and production processes and we have lower demand reduction, we need more. And we continue with the resource, energy, and greenhouse gas intensive lifestyle. So then we need a lot of deployment in the future with all the risks. So this is a societal challenge, an economic challenge, and this has all to do with the acceptance of these options, of these technologies, and also with the acceptability of climate policy. This is something which I want to come very quickly, because I told you that we need CDR before 2050 in order to compensate the residual emissions. But the residual emissions is not something which comes from heaven or is something which can be derived from a physical formula. So here you see basically different countries, how they see the unavoidable residual emissions. And some countries see agriculture where the most residual emissions are. Other countries see basically the building sector, the transport sector. And this has also a lot to do in the end with the economic costs and also with the social acceptability in the different countries. This is just to say that this is nothing which comes from physics, it comes from society and from economics. Before I continue with a more hopeful message, I would like to highlight an important aspect here, which is widely ignored. I told you then when I talked about the conventional CDR options and even the unconventional ones, like bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, or the afforestation and deforestation, you see basically in the end, many things has to do with land-based options. It has a lot to do with land-based options. But the problem here is, if you have land-based options, so then a problem emerges. So let's assume that, for example, in Germany, we would do a lot of CDR. We use biochar, we change our technologies in the agriculture sector, and we produce less food. So what would be the implication? The implication would be that the food demand in other countries like Brazil might increase. If the food demand is increasing, then there is a huge risk that they basically cut down the Amazon forest in order to expand agricultural land. So in that sense, land-based emissions is a global thing, and it is a very risky thing. And putting a price on emissions from the agriculture sector at the global scale is important, and it is also very important at the European level. So the EU's common agricultural policy has so far provided too little financial incentive to reduce emissions. So we have therefore a lot of residual emissions in the agricultural sector. So the most important instrument for applying the polluter-pay principle has been in place since 2005, because we have in Europe an ETS, two ETS systems, one for energy and industry, the other one for buildings and transport. But now people are discussing a third one for the agriculture sector. And you can imagine, so this is an extremely important aspect here, because in the EU, the agricultural emissions continue at a very high level. So they are not increasing, but they are also not declining. And therefore, an ETS3 for the agriculture sector is required. So the EU is discussing now an upstream system, for example, the processors levy. So the legal point of responsibility could the food processing industry, the large-scale food distributors, and so on. We could also do a more downstream thing where we basically impose the price on the farm level levy. So you might think about this is a very crazy idea to come up with a third ETS for the agriculture sector. How would agree with such a proposal? For example, France is doing this. France is now proposing this. Why? Because they want to combine this third ETS with a so-called CBAM, which is a tariff on land-intensive goods, and they want to basically impose a tariff on meat imports from Argentina and Brazil, and this is something which is now discussed in the EU. Now, what about the options, the potential, and the costs? I don't want to go into the details of this just very boring table, but what I would like to do is to emphasize one important point here. And one important point is that these different technologies differ in their capacity to store CO2. Some of them store CO2 permanently, like ducks, and others do not store this permanently. For example, for afforestation, it's 2 decades and 2 centuries. So there is a huge difference. And the difference between non-permanent and permanent storage of CO2 is one of the biggest challenges we have in the governance system. Now, if you listen to my talk so far, you might think, okay, this is something which is still irrelevant in the far distant future. Who cares about CDR when emissions are not declining? Why should we care now about this issue? This is something which in the next generation, people should take care of it. So again, this is a busy slide, but has a very simple message. And the simple message is in 2040, the European Union wants to become carbon neutral. And you see here, there are small residual emissions here. And this small residual emissions has to be compensated in 2050. Again, why is this important now? This is important now because the traders in the European emissions trading scheme try to anticipate, form expectations what will happen in 2039 when at the European emissions trading scheme, the last permit will be sold. So traders think if the EU Commission compensates then the emissions, everything is fine. But if the EU Commission is creating a lot of uncertainty about compensating the residual emissions, so then traders might then decide to buy additional permits now. The carbon market now could become quite illiquid, and the price might increase to an unprecedented in an unprecedented way. So, and this is a reason that is now a risk because of this 2040 target. It's now a risk that we have skyrocket prices and a breakdown of the ETS markets. And therefore, there is a strong need for the EU Commission to come up with a credible way to announce and to form credible expectations that they will compensate these residual emissions and how they will do this. So the end game, which is in 2039, is already has already a shadow into our current situations, and we are living in the shadow of this end game. And the EU Commission has to create a governance structure which find the traders on the market as credible. And this is exactly what the EU Commission is trying to do. So I will skip this. What I would like to do is in the end to come up with a governance proposal for the EU. We need a threefold step. The first one is we need a certification authority. If you have a carbon removal technology, a new idea, you need a certification that this is a reliable technology. Very simple. Why do we need such a certification? We need such a certification because only if you have a certification and you can credibly explain that you can create negative emissions, so then you should be allowed to sell such a credit. A second aspect is we need a kind of financing pilot projects. So pilot projects are financed in the Inflation Reduction Act in the US in an unprecedented way. We have not a comparable institution in Europe. And therefore, I propose a kind of a reverse auction scheme where Green Leap Innovation Authority tries to finance pilot projects. I think that's quite important. And in the middle of the whole thing, I argue that we need a European carbon central bank. Why do we need a European carbon central bank? First, we need a European carbon central bank just to compensate the residual emissions. This European carbon central bank could do this to introduce non-permanent permits with an expiring date. And if then basically the non-permanent removals expires, they have to basically introduce new, probably non-permanent removals or permanent removals. Somebody has to serve as a lender of last resort. And the most important challenge is, and I never talked about this in my talk, but I would like to do this now, we need a finance mechanism for the net negative emissions. And one thing is very important. We are trained as economists for a long time that everybody who emits should pay a price. This is exactly the implementation of the polluter pay principle. But when somebody is providing and supplying a carbon sink, she or he requires a compensation for that, a reward for this. We have to finance this. And this is not an easy task. And just to give you an order of magnitude, in 2050, we will basically sequester globally between 5 to 10 gigatons CO2. And if we have a price between 100 to 300 US dollars, this would require that the planetary waste sector would basically add up to 3% of world GDP, which is larger than the current car industry. So who has to pay for this? The finance minister could pay. It's very unlikely that in Europe they will do this. But what we could do is we could introduce overshoot permits. And then basically the suppliers of the current fossil fuel sector, the oil industry, could basically then provide this CDR option. But this cannot be done purely on a private basis. You need here, again, a lender of last resort. And therefore, we propose here a European carbon central bank. Now, let me come to the conclusion. So emissions, and these are the messages which I would like to convey to you. Emissions must be cut quickly and deeply to stay on track to meet the Paris goals, not in a few years, but immediately. I talked about the challenge. But in addition to cutting emissions, CDR is essential for achieving climate neutrality and managing the overshoot. This requires a coherent incentive scheme, as well as credibility and transparency on the CO2 market. CDR only works with good governance that addresses new technological, societal, institutional challenges and accounts for international climate cooperation. In particular, two fundamental principles have to be applied. The first one is whenever somebody emits, he has to pay. But when somebody provides a carbon sink, she or he deserves a reward. And this can, and how then this can be done is a huge challenge, a huge governance challenge, and therefore I proposed these three institutions. Sustainable managing the carbon cycle and establishing a planetary waste management system are key challenges for climate policy in the 21st century. And I hope I have convinced you that we are still in the phase one of climate policy, and I'm not saying that we have managed this first phase in a reasonable way. But we can only continue when we find an entry point into an industrial management of the global carbon cycle. This is a huge challenge, requires a lot of governance, but I think it is unavoidable to do this. And with that, I would say, then we can solve the climate problem, or at least we can manage climate change in a way which allows us to deal with it in a way which in the end keeps the challenges in checks. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you for that discussion. Really insightful on a lot of different topics there. It was interesting to see the different ways that CDR can be achieved with the more natural ways with afforestation and reforestation, but then the new technologies with docks and biochar and all that interesting technologies that are coming about nowadays. One question that I had related to that is, how do we implement that widespread implementation of CDR, and what are the biggest struggles that we've been experiencing so far that has been stopping us for having international or global implementation of CDR? Big question.
It's a big question, yeah. Yeah, first of all, I think, let me start with one response. So this year in COP28, it's a COP which basically the white elephant in the room will mention very often. These are fossil fuels. You might be surprised, but at the COP, many people talk about renewables, many people talk about all sorts of things, financing, loss of damage. but there is not so much about fossil fuels. And the oil and the gas industry is definitely part of the problem, but the oil and the gas industry has all of the technologies which are necessary for CDR. So therefore, it seems to me it's a good way to start a negotiation with them and say, okay, so you are part of the overshoot program because you will not reduce the exploration of the fossil fuels, but then basically you should part of also financing some of the CDR. So I think that could be a way forward, a very risky way, because many people are afraid that CDR leads to a kind of a mitigation deterrent. So we will stop to reduce emissions when we promise, so to say, in the future we might have something which is then in the end not credible. So this is not how we can proceed. But nevertheless, I think it is a good time now to talk about this and to find a way where basically the MENA region could finance at least some of the large-scale CDR projects. And my preferred option would be that in the end we could come up with an overshoot scenario where we basically with overshoot permits, we allow some industries to overshoot a bit, but then we give them the obligation for mitigating. So roughly speaking, it's a lot of problems has to be resolved, but I believe that in the end, use that in a modest way, that we could find an entry point.
And do you think that the overshoot permits and the overshoot scenarios and relying more or less on those corporations that have been contributing more to greenhouse gases is a way for us to ensure that CDR remains fair for those those countries that haven't been contributing as much? Or what would be your suggestion to make sure that those who are responsible are putting in more work versus those who have not been emitting as much?
Yeah, but that's a different question. So this is an important justice question, because who has contributed? And if you take into account the historical emissions, there is no doubt about this, that US and Europe has contributed a lot. And in my capacity as the chair of the ESMT, we have done such a study where we basically compared the fair share of Europe with what is feasible. And you see basically what we can do now and what is the fair share, given the historical emissions, even per capita, there's a gap. And this gap can only be filled with two options. This is what we had, deploying CDR. But the second thing is we have to finance other countries. We have to assist the countries to find a way to phase out coal. So we have to provide, which basically means the countries with large historic emissions, with a lot of transfers to countries which have not contributed. So if you look at the coal phase out globally, it's not just about China and India, it's also about Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh. So multilateral development banks could finance the coal phase out in a quite credible way. And this is what we have to do because of our responsibility. But this is not necessarily related too much with CDR. It is some link, but I would embed this in a broader justice issue.
Right. And I mean, you talked about those three governance sections right at the end of your talk here, relating more towards CDR and more towards the certificate, the central bank, and the innovation agency there. Is that a way that we can make sure that companies who are not willing to put in some of that work don't leave Europe or don't leave the United States? Obviously, yours are more EU-based, but are not contributing to carbon leakage is the term, and leaving the countries that are trying to do what needs to be done.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit first about the carbon leakage, then a little bit about the role of CDR, but the carbon leakage. So carbon leakage means that when some countries doing more for putting a higher price on emissions or whatever, so then basically other countries might do less, and then basically we, which means US and EU, would then lose the competitiveness, and then basically in the end so we incentivize the free rider. So in this context, the European Union has done a very significant step in last year in announcing what is called CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is basically a tariff on carbon intensive goods. And this is not implemented yet, but it is announced. And already this announcement had a significant impact on other countries. I give you two examples. The first one is India. India says, okay, when the European Union is imposing such a climate tariff, so then we want to price our own emissions. Why? Because if we would basically impose a tariff on Indian imports, so then basically the finance ministers in the EU basically get the revenues. If India is doing this with a carbon price, the revenues are at least with the Indian finance minister. So the announcement has also a strong impact on Turkey. Turkey is exporting a lot of goods into the European Union, but they said, okay, in order to avoid the carbon tariff, we want to impose an own price on our products in order to avoid that. US is doing almost the same. So there is a very interesting debate in the US. A senator from the Republican Party says we should basically impose a climate tariff on carbon intensive goods from China. This has many advantages. The first one is, so we reduce imports from China, according to the senator. The second thing is we get revenues, and we create also an incentive that other countries impose a carbon price. And so the US and many European countries are plagued with debts, in particular after 2026. And then I anticipate that most finance ministers around the globe, they are looking for additional sources. And this is a way how basically carbon pricing could be more prominent, at least in the EU, but also in the US.
Awesome. And being just a little bit mindful of time, I do want to open up the conversation to the audience here. You do have microphones in front of you, so please use those so that the people online can also hear. So yeah, let's open it up. A couple of questions. Yeah, go ahead. If you push the buttons right in the front. Yep. Sorry.
Yeah, a very interesting question. I admit that I'm quite skeptical about the voluntary markets. Just to explain what's going on in the voluntary market. So of course, the prices in the voluntary market are increasing because many multinationals, many municipalities have announced carbon neutrality goals, and they want now to have some compensation. I would say in that sense, there is not too much room for compensation if you want to really go to net negative. So this is an issue of the compliance market. And I would say I could only anticipate that DAX could play a role at some stage in the voluntary market, and this might be okay, because then the additionality is clarified. With all the other options, it is very hard to clarify the additionality, and also there's a huge regulatory challenge. So in that sense, my focus is more on the compliance market, and I see basically for DAX some role, but in the end, I think we should work faster to include then DAX into the compliance market and not to rely too much on these voluntary markets.
Including, if I might ask, including topics like tech-based solutions, for instance, in synthetic fuels and stuff like that.
Yeah, but I'm not sure why. Okay, yeah, this might be an option. So if you have, but again, we have DAX, you have atmospheric CO2, and then you can produce synthetic fuels, but synthetic fuels are quite expensive. And in the end, I would say, in the end, it boils down to the right balance between pricing carbon and rewarding things. And if you have the right price signal, then it's okay. And we see basically some dissemination carbon pricing schemes, but I would rely more on that instead of the voluntary markets.
More questions from the audience? Yeah, sir.
Let me start my question with a little story. A friend of mine invested into solar panels or solar parks. And he said one day to me, my life is really tough. I have 3 jobs now. I need to do lawn mowing all the time. I need to clean the windows all the time. And I need to count money. And I need to count money. And I don't care if after 20 years they make 70 or 80% of the initial, so to say, volume, because it's still free. So while we're talking a lot about the way to get there, from an economist's point of view, what does the future after we got there look like? And then the question really is on CDRs, on how do we avoid that we put too high a burden into our system for the future, so that we continuously have to compensate and never arrive really in paradise of free energy, if I'm exaggerating.
I'm not sure if I understood your point right. Are you saying that when basically we have 100% renewables, then energy will be free?
Well, I'm saying when we're at the other side of all these graphs and we've managed to do all this, what will the energy price be, question mark?
Yeah.
And what role will the continuation of CDRs play in that?
Yeah, okay, good. So first of all, what I would like to say is, so despite of all the technological progress we have seen in the renewable energy sector, so, and still I expect that there will be a continuation of a cost decline. In the end, if you think about the whole system, so you include the hard to abate sectors like aviation and shipping and so on, it is very likely that for some of the sectors we need synthetic fuels, right? And synthetic fuels will always be more costly even than the fossil fuels. So even if we see a decline, so we have to pay a price for this new energy system. And in the end, we have to pay a price also for becoming carbon neutral. And this is something which we would never do if there would be no climate change. So I'm not in the camp of people saying this whole transformation we would do even if there would be no climate change. We only do this because carbon neutrality is something which we will only do because of climate change, because we basically understood that there's a limiting disposal space in the atmosphere, right? That's the whole thing. And the cumulative amount of CO2 in the atmosphere determines the climate damages. And the climate damages will, by the end of the century, probably above $801,000 per ton CO2. So it is worthwhile to do. But without that, I don't think we would do this. Why? Because whenever we need hydrogen and we need then atmospheric CO2 to produce the synthetic fuels, I think then we have to pay a price for this. And if we would be very good with ducts or with synthetic fuels, so we could afford them with 200 to 300 euros per ton CO2. But this is still a price which we have to pay. And I do not deny at all the tremendous progress in the renewable energy sector. We need this because otherwise it would be even too costly. And also we should do exactly all these things at the right location where the renewables are really very, very cheap, right? So in that sense, for me, CDR plays a role, not so much in providing energy. This is a side benefit for when we use and we will use atmospheric CO2 only for a very, very few sectors because it's too costly. But the CDR option is basically to clean up the mess. It's not about energy. It's to clean up the mess, basically to use let's say, we have too much mess in the atmosphere, metaphorically speaking, and this we have to reduce. And this is the purpose of CDR, to keep the climate damages in check, right? It's not, we would do this even, or we should do this even we cannot provide then additional energy out of this. So that's the idea. And this is hard to swallow, right? That we have to pay a price for that. And this is very important to understand.
Maybe one more question before we end our discussion here. Anyone? Or any online questions? Have those been? No. Perfect. Then leaving it maybe on a positive note here, if we needed to know one good thing about what's happening, again, another really big question, but we talk a lot about climate change, we talk about the changes, and a lot of times that comes off as a very negative, scary thing, and perhaps it should, but how can we maybe look at something more positively at the end of our night here?
I don't think, I hope at least, I haven't conveyed a negative message. So I was very short in climate impacts at the beginning. And I talk, okay, there's increasing extreme weather events and there might be tipping points. Forget about this. Let's look at the solution. And I don't think the solution side is incredibly scary. Why should it be scary? So afforestation, deforestation, using woods for new buildings. There's a lot of innovation here. And a lot of startups are emerging now. Today in the morning, I had a very nice conversation where basically people offered a ducks, which basically produce as a co-product hydrogen. The whole thing is, it's new for us and we need a governance structure, but there is no need to be depressed. It's very positive. And the fact that we have to pay a price, of course we have to pay a price, but we get something, right? We get a stable climate. So what kind of more positive message you need? So I think this, and also when I say the planetary waste management requires between 1% and 3% of world GDP, it's just fine. I gave a talk a few weeks ago to local politicians, mayors of cities, and I talked to them like, look, what is the whole thing about waste management? I don't not talk about global, but waste management. So first of all, you need a deponey, and for this deponey you need a management. You need a price for this deponey, right? So this is exactly what we are doing with the price for the atmosphere. Then, if you have a waste management, you need a waste management sector. People are employed in this sector. So I don't think that's a depressing message. And they were quite excited and said, we know how to deal with garbage. We know about waste management. And in that sense, I would say this is, from my point of view, more an opportunity than a risk, and also setting up like such a thing like a carbon central bank, which serves as a lender of last resort. We had some experience. Of course, people not fell in love with necessarily central banks, but we basically learned to live with that. And we have the EU. The EU is basically providing a lot of service, not very much appreciated by many people. But I think the regulatory framework they provide for many things is one way why we are living in a relatively prosperous continent with all sorts of problems, admittedly. But in that sense, I would like to conclude with a positive note. And this is, in the end, what I told you is a management option, a management problem. And this is not necessarily something which should depress us. So management problems are a challenge, but not a reason for becoming too worried.
Right. So lots happening, lots getting done to battle this. This is good. Great conversation. Thank you again for stopping by ESMT, teaching us a little bit more about CDR and the other options that are out there. But with that, I would like to conclude our night. Thank you all for everyone that showed up to hear in person and everyone that was online as well. I'm hoping that we can come away with some great knowledge. Awesome. Thank you.